Hi, everyone. My name is Adam Ericksen, and welcome to the RavenCast. The RavenCast is part of the Raven Review, an online magazine where we write and talk about mimetic theory and the rivalry and violence and scapegoating that so often divides our communities. And sadly, we seem to be more divided now than ever, which is why I am so excited that we have Playwright Christopher Shinn on the show with us today. Hi, Chris.
Hey, Adam.
How are you today?
I'm doing all right. I'm hanging in there. How are you?
Good. I'm doing great. I am so excited to have you on because we are a divided community, and I am excited to have you on because you do a lot of theater. You are a playwright, and you write plays about communities that are divided, right?
Yes, I would say
Yes.
for a play to be interesting, there has to be some kind of division or conflict or violence lurking in the world of the play.
Yeah, it kind of reflects real life, and we're going to talk about that reflection of real life today. So I'm excited to have you on. So thank you for being here. Our motto at the Raven Review is change your view, change the world. So if you like to hear perspectives on religion and politics and pop culture and current events, perspectives that seek to bridge divides and bring people together, then please subscribe to the Raven Review at ravenfoundation.org. So today we have special guest on our show, Christopher Shinn. Chris is an award-winning playwright who has been profiled in the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, and American Theater. He has done interviews with BuzzFeed, the Creative Independent, Contemporary Theater Review, and now, Chris, finally, with the RavenCast. I mean, this is a big deal.
I'm thrilled to be here, and hopefully the gods will allow us to speak and hear one another.
Right. So Chris's plays have premiered throughout the world, including the Royal Court Theatre in London. And I just want to stop right there because Royal Court Theatre sounds like a massive deal. I mean, you're royalty. This is pretty awesome.
We do feel, I mean, the theater in America is great, but the tradition in England goes so far back, and it is always very special to have a play in London.
Yeah, and you were at the Royal Court Theatre for a while, right?
I mean, they were they discovered me. I mean, I really owe my career to them. They picked my play out of a slush pile in 1998, and they did it. And, I got to have a career as a playwright, which is not the easiest thing to achieve. So I owe the Royal Court a lot.
Yeah. You were young in 1998.
I was probably a little too young. I wasn't really ready.
Yeah.
It was a lot, it was a lot to begin a career that early. And I was full of anxiety, and I had no context, for a professional career. So to start at that level, that was a big deal. I was lucky to have a very nurturing group of collaborators, not only on that play, but, in the theater itself. Yeah. And so I was able to kind of get through my anxiety and really, start to build a career.
That's awesome. That's awesome. So Chris's plays have often also premiered at Lincoln Center Theater, Manhattan Theater Club, and the Goodman Theater in Chicago. Chris's 12 plays can be purchased on Amazon. 12, right? 12 plays?
Yeah, I don't know how I ever managed to do that.
That's awesome. Chris's play Dying City was a finalist for a Pulitzer Prize in drama. Congratulations there. That's a big deal. In addition to writing plays, Chris teaches drama at the New School in New York City. You can check out more of Chris's work at christophershinn.co. That's Shinn like the body bone, only with an additional N, right?
Yes.
2ns.co, not .com. So check them out there. Chris, thanks again for being here on the show. It's great to have you here. I'm interested. How did you get interested in becoming a playwright?
I think it was a mix of things, two things I think that combined. I mean, I loved acting. I was a bit of a child exhibitionist. I loved performing, singing, and getting up and, putting on little shows and stuff. And I enjoyed that. I enjoyed being looked at, being watched. And I liked being other people and using my imagination. And that, interest in other people and my inner world, I think, was what led to my interest in writing. And so I started writing stories, pretty early. And I think, I had kind of like two parallel tracks as a kid. There was the little actor, Chris, who was a ham and it was getting up there. And then there was this sort of deep, sensitive, very private boy. And I guess around 14 years old, those two tracks started to cross. I'd never written any plays. I'd only written short stories. But then there was a competition to write a play, statewide competition. And I thought, I love the theater. I love acting. I love writing. Let me try to write a play. And I wrote a play and I won the contest and they did a little reading of the play. And it really brought together those two parts of me, this kind of big exhibitionist and this very private, kind of tortured, isolated young man. And so it kind of was the best of both worlds. And I thought, this is it. This is, really what I'm good at, and what I like to do. And there was a major at NYU. There were not many undergrad theater playwriting majors, but NYU had one. So I got in there at 18. I went to New York, and really, I never looked back.
Wow. Do you remember what that play was about?
I do. I do remember what that play was about. I had my aunt had died, and I came to New York for the funeral. And my uncle had a restaurant in Murray Hill, and the night before the funeral, my cousin had his friends over, and we were 14 or whatever we were, and I was from the suburbs of central Connecticut, a town called Wethersfield, and I just thought my cousin and his New York City friends, they were like the coolest people in the world. And there was this one guy in particular I just was completely dazzled by. In fact, you might say, not to get ahead of ourselves, but I had a kind of mimetic obsession with him. I wanted to be him. He was so cool. I'd never met anybody like this in my mid-sized town where I'd grown up. And so after this weekend, which had a very sad and traumatic aspect for the family, I went home and I couldn't stop thinking about my cousin's friend. So I wrote him into a play. And I created this kind of wish fulfillment narrative around it, where basically a runaway from Louisiana comes to New York and he meets this really cool kid on a park bench. So it was a kind of a park bench play. There was another mimetic aspect, and I think I'd read The Zoo Story by Edward Albee, and I thought, well, all right, plays have park benches. I'll write plays set on a park bench. And I, created this relationship between this runaway and this city kid that really was my wish fulfillment desire to, hang out with this kid I had met through my cousin. So that was what that first play was. And interestingly, I'd say, despite all the wish fulfillment aspects to it, there was something really genuine in it too. I mean, it was about two people trying to deal with trauma and pain and not really knowing how to do it.
Wow, that sounds very deep. How old were you when you wrote this play? I mean, this is like high school, middle school?
I was 15 when I won the contest, so I had to be 14 or 15.
So, Chris, you've already mentioned mimetic a couple of times, and our work here at Raven is guided by René Girard's mimetic theory, and you have this really great 3-minute lecture on YouTube about René Girard, who developed this theory. So it has influenced your work. How were you introduced to mimetic theory?
I always wish I were, because it's become, such an important part of my emotional and intellectual life. I always wish I remembered more vividly the moment. I think it had to be one of two things. things. I know there's some book by J.M. Coetzee where he references René Girard. And it's just a passing reference, I think, to something to do with twins in maybe a novel in the early 2000s. I think he wrote some essays where he mentioned Girard earlier than that, but I think there was a novel, maybe Diary of a Bad Year, around that time. And there was a brief mention, and I really worshipped Coetzee, and I thought, okay, if he's reading this person, I got to find out who that person is. And then I was reading a lot of psychoanalysis at the time, and I'm sure there must have been a psychoanalytic paper where an analyst mentioned René Girard, because I have a memory of that too. Now, I don't know which came first, but it doesn't really matter. Around the same time, I saw the name Girard in two separate places, and I thought, all right, well, let me investigate. And so that's where it began. I'd say probably around 2005, 2006.
Yeah. And how has mimetic theory influenced your writing?
It's hard to say. I always write from my unconscious, so I always there's nothing deliberate about the way I begin writing a play. So it's, in a way, it's easier to talk about how the theory influenced how I look at the world or how I think of my own actions and my own behavior. I think part of that is just that I think it's always more interesting when a play is something that isn't organized or structured by the conscious mind. More kind of unusual and interesting and unexpected things happen if you open your writing to parts of yourself that you're not really in control of. So I'm sure like anything, it's influenced how I write. But because I write in such a unconscious driven way, it's hard to say exactly, how it's influenced my actual playwriting.
That's really interesting. As a writer myself, I do different kinds of writings, but I'm much more conscious, I guess, my writing style. What's your writing inspiration like?
The way I think of it is when you have a dream, you didn't write the dream consciously. The dream happens to you, but the dream came from you. There's no one else it could have come from. Yeah. So obviously what that means is that we have some place in us that draws on memory, fantasy, and reality to create characters and narratives in an incredibly complex, sophisticated way. And that's just a remarkable thing that I think we still don't value enough and aren't constantly marveling at enough. And so to me, writing is from a similar place, or I try to have it come from that place, just because I find it so, when you think of memorable dreams you've had, you can think about them, forever. They're so rich and detailed and textured and full of complication. So to me, writing is about, being awake, obviously.
Yeah.
Try to create a state of mind that kind of mimics the dream state, from which then, the characters and the world of the play and the action of the play can begin to emerge. And then, of course, as further drafts go on, I'm working with more and more of my conscious mind then to shape it.
That's fascinating. Like you're tapping into something that we in our larger culture generally don't tap into, or you're consciously tapping into something in your unconscious. It's just fascinating to me to hear you talk about this creative process. And maybe that's something that we're missing in the larger world, to be able to tap into this kind of maybe deeper sense of who we are, this dream-like state of who we are. Does that make sense, or am I off the wall?
No, I think it absolutely makes sense. And I think it's, one of the things that I think links sort of our dream life to mimetic theory and Girard is that, Girard talks about how we are often or usually not conscious of the mimetic roots of our behavior. And we're all also not conscious of our scapegoating of others. I think Girard says that we find it easy to see even somebody else's scapegoating a group, but we don't have scapegoats. We only have appropriate, criticisms and judgments on others. So, there's so much in our unconscious, and we find it very difficult, I think, to think about all of it.
Yeah.
So that is something I think art can do. And I think also that is one big reason I was attracted to René Girard. Although he criticizes psychoanalysis in much of his writing, he is interested in unconscious motivation and the unconscious roots of our violence.
Yeah, let's talk about that a little more. So Girard claims that he found this truth about mimetic theory through great fiction, including the great plays of Shakespeare. So can you talk more about the power of theater to reveal the truth about human relationships?
I think what's great about the theater is that it's there's something about watching human behavior in real time that is different than reading a novel or seeing a movie or watching a TV show. Obviously, in movies and TV, there's lots of editing, so time can and usually does move pretty quickly. And a novel, can move at various speeds depending on the writer, but there's still something almost dreamlike or certainly meditative and internal about the experience of reading a novel. A play really does involve being in the same place at the same time, watching human behavior, usually at greater length than in a movie. So I think, or TV. So I think what can happen in the theater is there's just a certain ability to see the big picture and a closeness in that you're in real shared time and space, but also a distance. So that there's usually a clear distinction between the stage and the audience. You're not immersed in a movie in a huge screen. You're not, lost in the prose of a novelist. So I think that critical distance combined with the kind of shared reality gives you a really unique perspective on seeing the truth of human behavior together, things in a unique way.
Yeah. Can you talk about one of your plays? Give us an example. You've written a play about twins, and you mentioned twins earlier. Which play was that?
I wrote a play called Dying City. I wrote it in 2005, and that's the last play I wrote before discovering Girard. So I must have discovered Girard shortly after finishing that play, which was produced in 2006 in London and then 2007 in New York. But I think I remember that feeling of that Girard was putting into words something I had started to intuit more and more. But there is actually an example of a mimetic motivation in that play. And I guess, I don't know if we've defined mimesis or mimetic in our little chat, but the simplest way to say it is somebody copies somebody else. That's how I think of it. There's somebody who's attractive for whatever reason, and you want to be that person or do what that person does or feel what that person feels. And so you model yourself after that person. In Dying City, there's a twin who dies, and the surviving twin is motivated to do something that his brother would have done, or he imagines his brother would have done. And I think it's an open question in the play, how much of that desire is his own and how much of it is his wish to be his brother whom he misses and, who's been lost to death.
Yeah. Yeah. And as you're talking about this, one of the most important things that you've brought up over and over again is the unconscious element of it. So we often think, mimetic theory just talks about how we copy one another, but I don't ever copy anyone. I'm my own person. I'm original. But this is unconscious, and it's not something that we think about. It's just something that we do. Even the desire to be original is a mimetic desire, because everybody wants to be original, right? But in writing a play, there is something that it comes from you. It's original because it comes from you, right? What's the balance between mimesis, imitation, originality, creativity? Because a lot of times people, when they first come to mimetic theory, think it's something that we are enslaved to, and there's a kind of a lack of freedom in it. But in the arts and what you're doing, there is this creative freedom that flows. So can you talk about that a little bit?
I think it's complex. What I tell my students is, when you learn how to speak, clearly you see there how mimesis structures how we learn. There's no way to learn a language without someone teaching you and without copying them. You copy the letters, you copy the sounds, you copy the words. And over time, you start to be able to understand what words mean more, and you start to be able to put your own thoughts together. But the basis of everything is mimesis. That's the foundation. Now, once that foundation is really built, then you can begin to create your own original thoughts. I think writing is really similar. If you never saw a play, it's hard to imagine writing a play.
Right.
Your early plays are probably going to be mimetic copies in some fundamental way of plays that have moved you. And, honestly, I never say which or which, because I don't want people to know necessarily. But I can look at some of my early plays, and I can see plays that I loved. And I can see how, maybe there's a different gender, or there's a slightly different emphasis. But I can see that a play that I loved and internalized and that meant a great deal to me is being worked through, reimagined, but in some ways it's just being copied, it's just being repeated. So I think that because we learn through copying never fully goes away. It's always part of the creative process. But just like learning language, the more you do it, I think the less you copy and the more you complicate what you have read and the things you have internalized as a viewer and as a reader. So, that's sort of how I think of creative writing. It's actually a real mix of mimesis and originality. But actually, you can never get past the mimesis fully. That is just a part of it. You're always recreating something on some level that you have seen, that you have been moved by and impacted by.
Yeah. So let's get a little more personal here in the playwright world. I'm sure that there are mimetic rivalries. So Gerard talks about mimesis, and we tend to imitate or copy one another's desires. And oftentimes that's desire for success or prestige. And I'm sure that this kind of mimetic rivalry infects all relationships, but also among playwrights. So can you talk a little bit more about that aspect of playwriting and what mimetic theory offers as a way out of this trap?
Yeah, I think that's, probably the real reason I was initially attracted to Gerard. It was a personal need. It was, I had never really seen anybody articulate what motivates us so clearly and convincingly. And I had been a student of psychoanalysis for quite a while by that point. And I, had learned a tremendous amount from it. And, felt like in many ways it opened self-understanding in me, particularly to do with trauma and to do with powerful drives that we all feel. But there was really nothing about the envy. I mean, there's a lot of writing on envy, but it was always posited as a kind of existing internal force that was inside of oneself. And what was extraordinary about Girard was that he focused on envy, but in the object of envy. He showed how we want to be someone that we admire, that has things that we want, that seems to have the kind of life and pleasures and rewards that we long for. And this just made intuitive sense, to me, because, one thing I feel like almost any playwright, unless you're a saint, will admit this. Yeah. But, you spend a lot of time as a playwright envying people who get, better reviews, bigger productions, better awards, and it can be debilitating, because the question you ask is, well, why does that person get things and I don't? And I want those things. So what do I have to do to get those things? And you can feel really driven and, not in a way that's conducive to making great art, to figure out what the key is. What are the secrets? And, you do that by obsessing over your models. Now that's like the positive variant. The negative one is you're just full of bitterness and anger and rage. And you say, why does that horrible, stupid person get these things? And, then you're driven to, significant battle in yourself around, self-destruction based on just rage and, feelings of persecution and injustice. So what reading Girard and coming to understand how we become obsessed with our models or rivals, however you want to think of them, the people that we want to be or defeat. I saw, okay, this is true of me, and this is not good for me as a person. It's not good for me as an artist. So now I have to figure out how to undo it in myself. How do I start living a different kind of life where I'm not obsessed with others, but I'm content with what I'm doing, what I'm making, and with my level of achievement. That was the real personal reason I became consumed with really reading everything Girard wrote, to try to understand how I could grow psychologically and not be so driven by envy and mimetic compulsions.
Can you talk about strategies for doing that?
I think it takes a lot of time, and it takes a lot of work. It's not something you can snap your fingers. It's how we're built. It's who we are, and so it's a constant temptation.
Yeah.
But I'll tell you a powerful moment. I won't say who it is, but I remember once meeting a writer who was very, very successful. That's an understatement. He was as successful as you can be. The very biggest awards, the very biggest achievements, astonishing wealth. But if you didn't know any of those things and you just talked to him, you would have thought this was somebody who had been, abused, rejected, persecuted. And I remember thinking, I see that resentment isn't actually about one's objective station in life. Resentment is something you can generate within yourself, no matter what you've been given, no matter what you've been, whatever you've achieved, whatever you've been awarded. So that was a big early lesson for me. I thought, okay, it actually isn't, my happiness isn't dependent on wealth and fame, because somebody who has those things is miserable. That was one of the big early lessons for me. I guess the other thing that I feel hesitant to talk about it because I feel I still struggle with it. I think what is clear, if you look at things objectively as an artist, is that good things don't always get good reviews.
Mm.
Things that get bad reviews aren't usually bad.
Mm.
So the mimetic attention, the kind of cultural energy that lands in a positive direction on certain writers and in a negative direction on others, is actually irrational and arbitrary.
Mm.
I think what's difficult about accepting that is that when you have these good moments where everybody loves you and says you're amazing, you really want to believe it's true. You want to believe, yeah, look, I did a good job and they're telling me I'm good. So this shows that if I do a good job and work hard, I'm going to get rewarded. But then what happens is, the next time you do a good job and you're proud of your work and they say, well, this sucks. You're not any good. You're bad. And it's devastating. You want to believe you have some control over what happens to you as an artist, but actually you don't. And really learning to internalize that insight that when they tell you you're good or when they tell you you're bad, it's actually quite arbitrary. That is hard. It's a hard thing. I'm still working to accept it. But I think that it's true. I think it's undeniable. And I don't say that to slight, my friends who have had great streaks and are doing really well. I'm not saying, oh, you're really bad. I'm just saying it could have gone another way. And when I see friends who have gotten bad review after bad review for really interesting work, I think you could have been lifted up and praised just as easily. So the kind of dynamics of scapegoating and things Girard talks about some being condemned and exiled, others being raised up, in Girardian theory, of course, they're one and the same. If you go way back to his, his scapegoat theory, in our world today, the scapegoat and the deity is more separated out. But I think the same dynamics are at work. The culture loves to scapegoat and exile some and deify and raise others up. But it is more about the mob. It's more about the culture and less about the individuals who are being raised up or, kicked to the curb.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So because we all struggle with this. So I struggle with this a lot in blogging. So I'm always comparing myself to other bloggers who always tend to get more attention than I do. And feelings of resentment easily start to fester. So what do you do with those feelings? What do you do? Is it a matter of, I hear you saying, I write stuff that I think is good. Is it a matter of just accepting that what I write is good stuff and however people respond to it is how they're going to respond to it and accepting it that way? Is that how you manage it? Or?
I manage it. I have a variety of tactics.
Yeah.
I think I try to, recycle my resentment into my work, to put that energy into something productive. That's one thing that I do. I think we all have a right to, have opinions and feelings. So I may communicate my feelings to my close friends in a way that I wouldn't publicly, but I think it's good to feel like this may not be my best self, but it's a part of who I am and I can share it with some trusted people. I question myself and I try to scrutinize my behavior and my opinions and address the resentment in me and separate, the parts that I think are good critical thoughts to have and the parts that are ungenerous and that I wish to work on. So I think the most important thing is to be able to feel everything. I was just teaching the chapter of I See Satan Fall Like Lightning, and Girard, it's just a little throwaway moment where he talks about in our era, the parent goes to work and their boss is really terrible to them, and they come home and they kick the family dog. Don't kick the family dog in all the ways that idea can be broadened out. I try to not take out my anger on any innocent creature, animal or person, or myself. So by having trusted friends I can bitch and moan to, by focusing on my own work and by engaging in relatively rigorous self-scrutiny, those are my strategies for dealing with my mimetic compulsions.
Awesome. Thank you. It's so helpful because oftentimes I want to bury my negative emotions, not pay attention to them, and they just tend to fester more and more and more. And I think the more we can get them out there to trusted friends, as you say, and also I think it's brilliant to find ways to put that into art, into plays, and because it's a reflection of real life, and that's what's so powerful about mimetic theory to me. And the conflicts that start getting driven through this, and being able to express it in a healthy way is a powerful way of managing it. But I've heard that all stories, including in theater and theater, are about conflicts. And if there is no conflict, then there is no story. Does that seem to be true to you? Do all stories need conflict in them in order to go anywhere?
Well, I think, violence is universal. You just have to look out your window or, open up the New York Times tab to understand that, there's so much violence in the world, you almost can't contain it in your mind at one time. You have to go into denial in order to function. So, I think the question is, how do you represent that violence in whatever form? You can write an interpersonal story with just a few characters, or you can try to write more broadly about violence on the political level or the social level. But, violence consumes us. We are everywhere in our world, is everywhere in a superficial way in our entertainments. But, I think of art as one of the places, there's a few, but one of the places where you can actually investigate violence meaningfully.
It looks like Suzanne has a question. So, Suzanne, can you bring yourself into the audio here?
I was really fascinated listening to Christopher talk about resentment and violence, and wondering how the theatrical experience impacts an audience. I know the Greek dramatists wouldn't even represent violence on stage because of the risk of contagion and incitement. And I'm just wondering, if you're watching really resentful characters on the stage, does that provide some sort of catharsis for you, or is there a risk that audience members over-identify in some way with the resentment and leave more resentful than they went in? Obviously you can't control audience reactions, but I wonder if you think about that in terms of what you do actually graphically portray or visually portray on the stage. Well,
I think what the really great dramatists did is they show the emptiness of catharsis. A great Shakespearean tragedy, I think, shows that when violence reaches a stage in which it manifests in blood and murder, it is not very nice. Doesn't feel good. It's not satisfying. I think that's true of many Greek tragedies as well. But obviously, in more superficial writers, often the catharsis is idealized. The evil is vanquished, and we go out on a high because the good has defeated the bad. And I think that's what's really dangerous, because the emptiness of that, the brief high, once that wears off, I think you're left back with the resentment and the emptiness and the rage. And then, your audience is leaving and they're going to have to find an object for that resentment. It may be that they turn on the TV and they watch another stupid movie or whatever. Mm-hmm. So, I think that, catharsis is a very tricky concept. You want to make sure it's the right kind of catharsis. And to me, you really need a great deal of awareness about the evil of violence in order to represent catharsis meaningfully. And in doing so, you kind of let the audience down gently. You're telling them the truth. You're showing them the emptiness of violence, but you're doing it in a way that is thoughtful and sophisticated. And I think the great Shakespearean tragedies, when they're well performed, they do that. You do feel all the excitement of mimetic violence ratcheting up, but there's really no way to idealize the violence that follows. So I think of catharsis as a way of kind of gently bringing the audience down from a truth. I don't want to use the word gentle in a way that makes it makes it feel like I believe the writer is protecting the audience. I think it's the opposite. The writer is confronting the audience with a very difficult, painful, even horrifying truth. And because of that, has to make sure that it's the denouement is very thoughtful in order to not leave the audience too traumatized in a negative way. I think it's okay for an audience to be traumatized in a good way, in the right way. And I think the crucifixion story is one of those stories where there is, horrific violence and terrible pain and agony, but it leaves you with hope, and it leaves you with the ability to self-scrutinize. So yes, I think there's a way of representing violence that keys us into a deeper understanding of violence rather than leaves us with despair or resentment in a way that could lead to even greater violence.
It's really fascinating to me because you just mentioned the crucifixion, and I'll often hear people say, "Oh, the Bible is too violent," or for modern movies or even theater, people will criticize something as being violent. But as you said, when you started off with this question about conflict, there's violence and conflict throughout our world. I mean, it's not something that we should be avoiding. It's something that we should be investigating, as you say. So I love what you're doing because you're challenging us not to avoid violence, but to interpret it in a particular way, to understand it in a particular way.
Yeah, I mean, what I find remarkable about the crucifixion is when Jesus says, forgive them, Father, they don't know what they're doing. What's so amazing to me about that is it's a very, concise bit of dialogue. But Jesus is saying that we have an unconscious. He said they don't know what they're doing, right? So that means we have an unconscious, and the unconscious is violence. What they're doing is killing. Yeah. And what's remarkable about that is we want to deny our violence, and Jesus sees that. So, to me, the artist has to be able to say, here is violence. This is us. This is what we do. We're not aware of it. We don't know what we're doing. And what we're doing is violence. So, that is the paradox of representing violence. It's, you don't want to do anything that makes violence seem good and exciting, but you do have to represent it because our desire is to deny it so strongly or idealize it, and to find a way to look at it so clearly and compassionately as Jesus does. I think that is one of the things an artist is doing. And I think it's really important because violence is usually represented in an exploitative way.
So, Chris, we're down to our last couple of questions. We've been talking a lot about violence, and I imagine this understanding of violence is one of the things that you try to achieve in your plays. Are there other things that you try to achieve in your plays?
Uh, I think uh, I think the thing I most want is, well, put it this way: I don't believe that a play can do very much in isolation, or in aggregate. I don't think 20 plays can do very much either, let alone one play. So, I try not to have grandiose goals. But the danger of that is then you think, well, if the play can't do much, then who cares what I write? Who cares what anybody writes? So I try to have a goal that's modest, but real and important. And I guess the way these days I say it to myself is, I just want people to leave thinking a little bit about their lives in a new way. I think that's a reasonable goal, and I feel like that's something a good play can do. And if I can nudge someone a little bit to think in a different way about themselves and their behavior, then I've done something remarkable. So that's what I like audiences to take away, just something to think about in their own lives.
Awesome. So what are some of your current projects? What do you have coming up?
I have a play that's going to be on the Almeida Theatre in London in August. It's called Against, and it's actually about violence. That's sort of the theme of the play. And it's kind of a big one. It's a very exciting play, lots of characters, and covers a lot of territory. So I'm very excited about that. And then I'm starting to, just begin to work on a new play that's been commissioned. I can't say much about it specifically, but it's a very exciting project. And then I'm trying to, respond to life today, and everybody watches TV. So I have a couple of TV show ideas that I'm developing right now and hope to pitch. So we'll see how that goes, but no news to report. But I'm working on some ideas that I'm actually pretty excited about. One that deals with desire, and one that deals with our experience of death. So those are my projects at the moment. I'm continuing to teach and mentor emerging writers.
That sounds very exciting. So that's awesome. Well, Chris, thanks again for being with us here today. And thanks to everybody who joined us live. We will post this recording tomorrow, Friday, April 28th. So you can catch it there at the RavenFoundation.org. So Chris, if people want to keep up with your projects and with you, how can they do that?
You can go to my website, christophershinn.co, and there's a link to email me if you want to email me directly. And my social media at this point is pretty much limited to Twitter. So I'm on Twitter, Chris_Shinn. And that's one of the places I release my resentments, hopefully in an entertaining, interesting way.
Awesome. Good. Well, everybody can stay up to date on the RavenCast by joining the RavenCast group page on Facebook. You can also like the Raven Foundation Facebook page. And if you're watching this on YouTube, please give this a like. And if you're listening on iTunes or Stitcher Radio, please subscribe and leave a 5-star review. Just want to say again, Chris has this amazing 3.5-minute lecture on YouTube. So you can just go on YouTube and type Chris Shinn in the YouTube search engine and it'll come up. Highly recommend. Nice, concise, mimetic theory, 3.5 minutes. Excellently done, Chris. I love it.
Thank you.
Yes. So one more thing, go on to Raven Review at RavenFoundation.org and subscribe over there to our emails. And that way you'll keep up to date on articles and interviews like this one. So thanks again, everybody, for joining us. Until next time, grace and peace be with you. Bye-bye.